Would like to explain a little bit about some factors that I think are present that drive a shift towards ethical design. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about how to see ethical design as a business and how we can actually run a business on ethical design. And last but not least, I have a few ways and a few suggestions on how and where to start this process and this ethical transformation, if you will. So if we just look at ethical design, the definition of ethical design, what we did in the ethical design handbook that I very recently co-authored along with my two good partners, Martin and Kim, was we defined ethical design as businesses and products and services that grow from a principle of fairness and fundamental respect towards everyone involved. So this is a pretty broad definition, right? But you could definitely see accessibility in here. You can also see research here, but you could also see ethical business models here. So looking at something like data collection, how much data do we collect? How do we store it? How do we use it? So it's a pretty broad term. And what I'll primarily dive into is sort of the business side of this. Again, to help you make that compelling case to serve that purpose. Now, I guess most of us know, or all of us know, and have seen lots of examples of the problems that we have with ethics in the digital industry. So this image that you're seeing on your screen is a super famous photo of Mark Zuckerberg, who proudly was photographed when one of his posts reached 500 million likes. And then in the background, you have his laptop with the webcam taped over. So he also knows that there are lots of privacy problems online, but he is one of the biggest advocates for us sharing as much as possible. And we all know the deep ethical problems related to Facebook's business model. Now, if we just look a little bit more on data collection, we know that the data broker industry is booming. There is an industry called data brokering. And one of the major brokers in the industry is called Oracle. And Oracle can provide access to 5 billion unique customer IDs in the world. So that's pretty much, I would assume, the entire online population. This is extraordinary numbers. And it's really staggering that this is even taking place, but it is. This is a very, very lucrative business to be in. A lot of companies have realized this. Bounty Pregnancy Club, which is a pregnancy club in the UK, was fined last year £400,000 because they were actually trading data. So up until April of 2018, they'd collected lots of data on their subscribers. So, the gender of their babies, feeding patterns, all sorts of very, very detailed private data. They had access to this. And what they actually did was they sold it to, I believe, 39 different companies, including marketing companies. And they were fined for doing so because they hadn't, they basically hadn't told their members that they were selling their data. Another example that I've come across was an app called Onavo Protect. So Onavo Protect is a VPN app for Android. And they claim on their website, or it claimed, that they would help you protect your personal information. So at the point of the tipping point, Onavo had 24 million users. And they went ahead and sold the data of the 24 million users to Facebook. So, I mean, it's super ironic that a VPN app would do that to you, right? On the lesser severe end of the scale, but still something that we consider deeply unethical, are all the companies, all the websites that use all these tricks, all the tricks that they basically exist in the book to make you buy stuff that you don't necessarily want or don't need at the exact time. So all these manipulative patterns. actually to people that have multiple sclerosis or other types of diseases. I've actually heard that, talk to people that tell me that they can't use websites like this because all these different pop-ups and notifications and alarms actually trigger stress in their nervous system. So even if it's not as unethical as selling, your data, the data of your users, it's still something that's actually pretty serious. Now, there are some factors that drive a shift to ethical design that I would like to explain a little bit about, and particularly 3 factors are interesting that we're seeing surface now. So the first is transparency. Now, people are getting increasingly used to transparency, right? We can look up basically anything we want online, it being reviews or product information. We can be the experts, if you will, on products. Whereas 20 years ago, you basically had to go to a store and ask the clerk for information and advice on certain products, right? We can look all this stuff up online, regardless of what we want to buy. And, companies can't hide these things. So this particular screenshot is from the App Store with a 1-star review. And this is actually, it's interesting. It's actually Zoom that got this review. It says it's seriously bad. You're charged for calls and it keeps crashing. Also, did I mention that this is used to crush a lot of teenagers' dreams or just a tiny bit of free time? I think this refers back to I think this review was made just in the beginning of the Corona crisis when they were all sent home, but then their teachers just, had to force them to go on Zoom instead. But the point is, companies can't hide these types of reviews anymore. Back in the day, before the internet, you would go to the store and you would complain, and maybe you would tell your neighbor and your friends, but you didn't have the massive reach. You didn't have that soapbox. Everyone now has a portable soapbox that we can stand on whenever we're displeased with something. So that type of transparency is really driving the change. Something that also has become increasingly apparent is how much we dislike something like hidden costs, right? This is an example of a car rental where the price magically increases from $287 to $407 dollars. And we don't really know what all these fees are about, and they don't surface until the very end of the purchasing process. And all these things become very apparent, and we can complain about it, and we can give 1-star reviews on Trustpilot. And this is something relatively new compared to just a few years ago. And this is all driving that change towards a increasing demand for transparency. Now, there's lots of data that supports this. Baymard is an analytics company, that institute that does lots of research on e-commerce, and they showed that 24% of users have abandoned an order within the past 3 months because they couldn't see or calculate the total order cost, which is it's a pretty high number, that a quarter of users abandon a purchase, right, an order. Just because they couldn't see or calculate the total order cost, because we are in this high demand for this transparency, that if we're unsure, we'll just go somewhere else and spend our money, because there is almost always a competitor just around the corner, or on the next click. You don't have to drive to the next town. You can basically just open the next tab in your browser. So one thing that I would like to stress is that transparency doesn't just have to do with pricing or reviews. It also has to do with the way that you run a business. So I don't know how many of you know this website. This is Links Cars. I was thinking when I was preparing for this talk that from an accessibility standpoint, this is pretty much me saying that Links Cars is a great example. It's like putting my head in the mouth of a lion. I don't know if you what type of analogy you have for that in British, but I'm not claiming that the design is good from especially from a Scandinavian design point of view. this is deeply challenged, right? And you know, Ling knows it, and she doesn't really care because she says that her website is more about customers than about cars. But my point is that Ling's Cars has gone to a great extent to actually ensure deep transparency into the way that she runs the business. And she is incredibly successful. She is struggling as well with Corona, but she is making do, and she has run a really, really successful business for many years. One of the things that she does is she has a hilarious privacy policy, by the way, but also it just becomes so apparent that she actually takes care of her customers. So I'm just going to read it out loud. It says, I would love to sell it, so the data, because I would make a fortune out of it, but I don't. I put it all on a compost heap called old data and I sit on it. Eventually worms eat it. So that's basically what her way of saying, I protect your data, right? And that's what she does. She knows that she has tons of information that would be very, very valuable for her to sell, but she makes it a point not to, and she makes it a point to explain that she doesn't do it. So transparency very much goes beyond just pricing models and things like that. There is a high demand for transparency in how the business is run. And because you can't run a sound business if your pricing is transparent, but at the same time, you're violating people's privacy by selling their data. It's not compatible. So the second factor that is driving this change towards, or this shift towards ethical design, is traceability. So I remember back in the day when all you got when you bought something was a paper receipt, right? And if you lost the receipt, there was nothing you could do if you know the thing that you bought broke and it wasn't your fault. You know, you couldn't really take it back to the store because they would just say, well, I don't know if you bought it here or when you bought it, etc. You can't trace it, right? But today we have this massive amount of digital traceability opportunities, which is actually a potentially an advantage both for customer and for the business. Because, you know, sometimes you never want to get into that situation where it's just their word against ours, right? But we sometimes do that. And so today it's much easier for everyone to prove what actually happened. And I just want to go back to Ling's Cars for a second, not mentioning the website and the problems. But what Ling has actually done is she has created a system called Lingo, obviously, where she basically transcribes every single customer interaction that she has with, and you know, this is made accessible to the customer and to her and to whoever is involved, which means that not only written transactions are documented, but also phone calls and things like that, which really has taken this transparency and traceability to a new level because everything is documentable. The third thing that I want to stress as something that is driving this change is the need for simplicity and the expectation of simplicity. So another Baymard study shows that in 23% of cases where an online purchase is abandoned, it's because of an overly complicated checkout process. When we have to click too many times, or when things are just, you know, a mess and we can't figure out exactly what's going on, we leave. We take our business elsewhere. So this is another compelling case towards improving the design of interfaces and the design of systems, because people will leave if it's not simple enough. So that's something that, again, is driving that change towards ethical design. But it's really hard to just keep talking about the business case of ethical design if we don't look at how to measure it, right? Because we also have to realize that it's not like changing one hugely successful business model into one that's even more successful. We have to stop thinking about change being something that's only driven by the expectation of making a huge profit, right? So it's like, unless we don't make 100% more, we won't do it. So ethical design is a viable business case, but it's not necessarily something that will make you rich overnight. And I think it's not fair to compare it to that type of lottery ticket. That's just very important to understand. But we don't often talk about the cost of making money, but we should. I mean, what's the cost of not treating your customers well to make these types of pop-ups where you use strange language, or what's the cost of the additional amount of support calls you get from selling poor products, or having to return an excessive amount of product? What is the cost of that? We don't really calculate that into the equation, but we should. So here's another example that I just wanted to bring up of something that's just super dubious, and something that definitely doesn't, where this type of behavior definitely hasn't been calculated as part of the drawback. So Huel sells protein shakes and stuff like that, and Huel thinks it's a great idea to add products to your shopping cart even though you haven't added them yourselves. So when you open the website and you open the product web store, it has 2 products in it by default. And that's strange, right? But because what if I don't want the chocolate and vanilla powder? What if I want the berry or whatever? What if I don't want the products that they put in my shopping cart? You don't go into a supermarket and then your cart is magically full of products that you then have to put back, right? But that's actually what Huel, with a smile, asks you to do. So they say that the vanilla and mint chocolate are pre-selected when you go onto the page, as these are the most popular. So obviously everyone wants them, right? However, if you don't want them, simply click the minus next to the quantity and these should leave your basket. Smiley. This is just beyond stupidity that you would think that this is something customers would want. And there are tons of other smart ways to make use of very, very simple purchase data that would actually make sure that if I actually wanted the vanilla and mint chocolate, that would always be in my basket. But if my neighbor wanted the berries, that would always be in his basket, not the other way around. That's actually not rocket science. And that also, from a data handling perspective, would totally fall into the ethical, frame to do so by using this simple purchase data. But instead, they just think that everyone wants the same. So I would assume that this adds a lot of cost, either from returned shipments or from angry customers that take their business elsewhere. So at the end of the day, the ultimate business, I lost my thread here. So the most compelling argument you can make towards ethical design is that it builds brand loyalty. And brand loyalty is sort of the ultimate goal for most businesses, right? The more loyal your customers are, the more prone they are to come back and to refer you to others. So loyal customers have always been a coveted thing, and that hasn't changed. And with the internet growing, over the past 20 years, brand loyalty has decreased because we can always find a competitor just one click away. So the notion of building brand loyalty has become harder, and ethical design builds brand loyalty, regardless of whether you think of complying to high standards of accessibility or making a really nice, simple functioning website that just works, or whether it's making sure that the data of your users is kept safe, that you don't spam them with newsletters, that you treat them well. All this grows brand loyalty, and that is probably the most compelling business case you can make for ethical design. Now, basically what I claim is that what you can do if you tweak some things to make your design more ethical is you get the better results within the same budget and within the same deadline. And essentially that is all every manager wants to hear. So you don't spend more money, you didn't go over the deadline, but you produce better results. That is a win. And you can actually do that with ethical design. And I can show you a few ways of making it to that stage where you can actually prove that. Because the proof is really important, right? You can't just claim it. You have to be able to prove it. And I'm also claiming that ethical design is not more work. It's just different work. It's not like we have to learn a whole new toolbox. We just have to do things differently. But we have all the toolboxes, all the tools in our toolbox for measuring, for instance, right? We know that we can measure through KPIs. We know how to set them. We know how to benchmark. We know how to do a risk analysis, right? A risk matrix. And we know how to measure over time. So all these tools are not new, but we just have to think about using them slightly differently and maybe measure on different types of things than we're used to. So because, you know, all this measurement stuff comes with a warning. Not everything is suitable for measurements. This is a screenshot from a Net Promoter Score example. A Net Promoter Score basically has a question that states how likely are you to recommend a product to a friend or colleague. And in this example, we are asked to recommend Windows 10 to a friend or colleague, how likely we are to do that. And the explanation goes, I need you to understand that people don't have conversations where they randomly recommend operating systems to one another. This never stops being hilarious because they're so right. I mean, the problem with a measurement like NPS, Net Promoter Score, is that it's a vanity metric that's used to benchmark against competitors. And the way it's calculated is actually quite complicated and very strange. And it doesn't take into account how all of the sort of nuances in between. It's either, you know, 1 or 8, 9, 10. That's, you know, interesting for the sake of the measurement. But one thing that I would say is actually a good place to go to figure out what to measure is by using a scorecard. So this is a specific example of a scorecard that we produced for the Ethical Design Handbook that relates to things around UX and UI. So a scorecard consists of a set of statements. And these statements can be different depending on project and company. We've tried to generate these more sort of generic scorecards that relate to certain categories of a business and processes. But you have a statement, then you have an evaluation score that is typically between 1 and 5. You set the evaluation, and then each statement has a weight and a total score. So the weight depends on how important it is considered, the statement is considered for the project or the business, right? And so if something gets a 1, it's because, you know, there are big problems, and if it gets a 5, it's because there are no problems at all. And then at the bottom you get an actual score compared to the highest possible score, which gives you this test result quotient. And using these types of scorecards, either as a holistic tool or as a KPI, actually gives a pretty good idea as to where you fall short and where there's room for improvement and where you perform well. And I think a lot of us tend to not look at processes or a product from this more holistic review, because we get KPIs from, you know, from sales, and then we have to comply to those. But we very rarely have KPIs connected to UX and UI, for instance. So you can either use, you know, the end result of the scorecard as your KPI, or use more granular statements, because it depends on, again, on the project and on the company, whether it makes sense to set a KPI as a total score from everything that goes on in UX and UI or communications or data collection, or whether it makes more sense to say, okay, how do we actually perform on an established process for testing all UX copy before release, right? It depends on the project, but we have to get specific, and we have to start measuring these things to be able to drive a change, because we can't change and improve what we don't measure, because we basically don't know what the success criteria is if we don't do that. So to get started on ethical design, on the transformation, I think, well, not I think, I know that it depends very much on your role. You know, there's a big difference between being the business owner or being part of a development team or part of a design team, or, you know, having a management role. So it very much depends on the type of role you have. But I will say that regardless of what role you have, you can actually make, you know, granular small changes. And the further up you are in the hierarchy, and, you know, the more responsibility you have, the bigger a change you can obviously drive from the get-go. So I'd also just make a point of saying that these quick wins, these lottery tickets, this guy looks partly surprised by his big catch. But this is, you know, this is quite rare. So we have to stop thinking about getting these big wins. A lot of ethical design improvements will happen granularly and over time, because these types of changes takes time. Right? It's like the digital transformation that some companies are still, you know, under, but that took a lot of time as well, and so will the ethical transformation. But the most important thing to do is to identify what challenges you have, regardless of whether that's in a project or in an entire company or in a team. And you can, again, you can do that by doing an ethical, a scorecard review, right? That gives you a pretty good understanding of the state of things, what needs to be improved, and what can we, you know, what can we use as the catalyst to drive this forward. But we have to understand, you know, the landscape of our product, the landscape of our project or of our business, to understand what we can tweak to improve. We can't just hide our heads in the sand. We have to start looking at these numbers. So if you, for instance, are a developer or designer or accessibility specialist on a team, you can go guerrilla, right? Because that's totally doable. And it's actually a pretty good way of establishing and proving the business case in an organization that doesn't necessarily see the huge benefit yet. You can absolutely be this guerrilla or take this guerrilla approach to that. And the way to do that is actually a series of steps. The first thing you do, if you have control of a project, right? If you have the responsibility of a project, instead of just going ahead with it like you normally would, what you start by doing is saying, okay, what type of KPIs could I connect to this project that speak to ethical design? It could be something related to customer satisfaction, or to you know, UI improvements, or to reducing or removing all types of errors that relate to a specific thing, right? So you establish these KPIs, then you implement the changes. You know, all these steps are totally common, right? And then you measure and document the results and the improved results. So when you have these results, you go to your boss and you show them off. Because again, what you come to them with is, you say, okay, I didn't go over budget, I didn't exceed the deadline, but I got better results. Why don't we scale that to the organization? And it's, you know, as in so many other negotiation situations, making it easy for the other person to say yes is actually a really, really good strategy. And that goes for all decisions that you want to, that you would like to bring forward. Making it easy for the other person to say yes is actually a really good formula. And proving these results is definitely easy to say yes to if you're sitting in a management position. Why wouldn't you want better results within the same budget and the same deadline? You would be a fool to say no, right? But we have to understand, and I think this is, I think a lot of people think that ethical design kind of belongs to one department, right? To probably over in the design, because, you know, if we evaporate all the dark patterns, all the dubious design patterns, we're good, right? Then we have ethical design, but actually we don't. Ethical design relates very much to the business model. It relates very much, obviously, to the experience and the design. but it also connects to sales and marketing and development. It is something that everyone has to take charge of and take ownership of. And if you're in a management position, it's actually a really, really good idea to create what we call a governance model, an ethical governance model. So Guerrilla is more for people on a team that have, project responsibility. So if you have team responsibility, or maybe even organizational responsibility, creating a governance model is a really sound approach to getting this started. So a governance model is a set of rules that everyone agrees to comply to in a project or in a way that a business is run. And from an ethical standpoint, it's an ethical governance model should consist of the ethical standards and objectives that you are complying to, that you're trying to achieve, and also how these things that you build should be designed to meet these objectives. So if the objective is privacy first, how do we ensure privacy first, or privacy by default, in the way that we develop new features? Do we make sure that data collection is kept to a minimum, and how do we do that? Do we make sure that all data is sent on in an encrypted way? Do we only store the data for 6 months? What specifically do we do to make sure that we comply to these ethical standards? The governance model also has to include the responsibility and freedom for employees, because this is actually quite important. Part of running an ethically designed business, and part of working with ethical design, means that we take responsibility. And we have to give that responsibility and freedom to the team, right? To the people who work with us. So if someone sees something that's wrong, they fix it, and then they notify their the stakeholders or their boss, right? It's not the other way around. They shouldn't have to ask for permission to change or to fix something that is, apparently broken, that is obviously broken. But this type of freedom has to be explicit, because people don't necessarily take that responsibility or freedom, because there are lots of examples of companies where that type of behavior isn't condoned. So an ethical governance model has to include this type of material. And last but not least, it also has to include information about how tests are performed and their success criteria. If we don't know the success criteria of something, we don't know when we succeeded, right? If we can't succeed in something that we don't measure, so we need to understand that criteria, and we need to also be in agreement of that success criteria. Because if everyone knows the success criteria, we can also celebrate when we actually reach it, and that's quite important for the well-being of people in general. So I think it's important for me to state that having this explicit responsibility doesn't have to do with accountability. So I had to bring up Trump in this, because Trump is, Trump blames everyone but himself for everything that goes wrong in America, right? Right now, it's apparently China's fault that the coronavirus is spreading in the US, even though China has managed to contain to I believe 4,000 deaths, and the US is over 20,000 by this point. But he constantly blames. So it's not about who can we blame. It has to do with who has the responsibility to act. There is a big difference. And I'm not sure, I don't think it's an American thing per se, that they, that it's important to have someone to blame, but it's, having a good ethical governance model is actually quite the opposite. It's about giving the power to people so that they can act and take that responsibility. So, a governance model, as with any rule of, rule set, if it's not followed, it doesn't help if it's not followed. So it's also very much a matter of nurturing a culture that supports these types of rules that we set for each other. And that's obviously the whole underlying piece that needs to be there for this type of thing to succeed. So if you ask me when is the best time to get started, I'd say that there is never a better time than now. And I don't mean now because we're all under lockdown and Corona and all that's, you know, every minute is the right minute. Because as I hope I've made clear, you know, regardless of what role you actually have the power to do some impact, but it's not something that will change overnight unless we get businesses that are built on these principles from the get-go, like DuckDuckGo, the search engine that doesn't track people, or other, there are, you know, some other examples out there that actually build, where the whole business is actually built on the pillars of ethical design. If you don't have the fortune to be hired to work with that kind of company, it's a matter of starting small and seeing these improvements scale over time. So there is never a better time than now. And with that, it's time for a small summary. We all know that there are deep problems in the digital industry, and certain companies make a fortune of selling other people's data. But at the end of the day, ethical design has to do with, is a great driver towards building brand loyalty, which is a very good foundation for running a sound business that thrives. It's a matter of understanding that we can get better results within the same budget and meet the deadlines. And that is basically the best business case you can make for ethical design. So we have to understand where the opportunities are and where we fall short, because we can't improve what we don't measure. So it's a matter of starting to understand, where do we fall short, what can we improve, and start measuring for those improvements and initiating those improvements. But it is definitely, with confidence, I'm saying that ethical design is a sound business. It's not for all businesses, and that's okay, but it is a sound business model, and we have to start treating it as such. So ethical design is not more work, it's different work. We have to change our mindset slightly and just use the same tools that we've used always in slightly different ways, and especially with different types of outcomes. And obviously, this is just scratching the surface, and we have lots and lots of material, including some really interesting stuff about accessibility as well, actually, in the Ethical Design Handbook, which was recently released through Smashing Magazine. And with that, I would say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Trine.
You're welcome.
I feel enlightened.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a great word.
Yes, yeah, it's time to read the book in full now.
Oh yeah, if you haven't done it yet, you should.
I've been saving it until after the talk. Felt like the talk was going to be a primer.
Oh, okay, yeah. But I think you'll enjoy it if you enjoyed this part. Let me just stop my screen sharing here.
Sure, I'll look forward to it. So Lewis is asking for a link to the book. Lewis, it's on Smashing Magazine, so I'll dig out a link just now, but you'll probably be able to find it pretty easily as well on Smashing Magazine. Does anyone else have any questions while I get that link?
I really loved the talk. I really loved the link to people showing how many people are buying, how many places less are sold out, and how many places less. I didn't thought about it before, about an ethical part and about an accessibility part, like people are getting too much stress and getting the nerves, but I really love this link and this insight that is linked to an ethical and an accessible. Really happy with that insight from you, Trine.
Well, thank you very much. That was great to hear. Yeah, I mean, we actually have a big section in the book about designing for the most vulnerable, because that is also very much a key part of designing ethically, right? Is to consider people that are vulnerable, whatever that means. That could be, you know, designing for accessibility, designing for children, which is something that I've worked a lot with in the past, and which is actually what made me more interested in the field of ethical design, because kids are really exposed to so much, not just danger, but just so much bad design and so much manipulative design out there. And that's happening to all of us, but you know, people who are vulnerable for one reason or the other are especially put in the front of this, and it's deeply problematic. Other questions? I put the link to the book in the chat.
Yeah, I forgot you had your whole own website for the book.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we have a website for the book, of course. Deserves it. It's, oh, Louis, I really enjoy seeing that. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know what you think about it once you've read it.
Well, any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So hi, my name's Saran. I have a question. What's your favorite argument that you use if someone is disagreeing with you, anything related to ethical design? Because you come across those arguments, I guess, quite often. And some of those really need to be compelling. And I was thinking if you had like a favorite one.
Yeah. So one, I think there are certain people that I just don't bother arguing with. So if you put someone in front of me from Google or Facebook, and they would try to convince me that their business model was, was ethical, I don't think that I would waste my time, because I genuinely don't think that they would see it, that they would accept my point of view, and that's okay. But I would say that from anyone else who says, well, I often have people saying, but dark patterns work. But yeah, they do. But that doesn't mean that other not dark patterns don't work. And the thing is, when we did, we actually researched for this book for about 1.5 years. And all of us combined, Martin and Kim and I, have a huge network in multiple fields, but we couldn't get a single company to stand up, with name and say, okay, we realized we had this dark pattern, and then we got a huge backlash, and then we changed it, and then our business improved, because they don't want to hang out their dirty laundry. But that actually has happened. When a dark pattern or an unethical conduct is exposed, and someone is standing on their soapbox and telling it to the world, and they have a huge reach, it actually does hurt business. So it's not just about doing the right thing, it's also about understanding that the wrong thing can be really hurt the business. And we haven't even started to talk about legislation, right? From an accessibility standpoint, we're seeing a huge increase in lawsuits, right? Domino's was the last sort of really huge case, right? For websites that for a website that didn't want to comply to accessibility standards. But legislation is also a part of it, and in Europe we have GDPR, which is something that a lot of companies are afraid of. So if they don't do their data handling ethically, what we consider ethically, they run the risk of getting a lawsuit on their hands. But it's, it was a long answer, I'm sorry, but there are tons of different arguments that I actually think are interesting and important.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, Guy, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this isn't a question, but it's more of a comment. I was interested in all of this because we actually have a serious question of ethical design in the accessibility industry. That's with all these automated tools, test tools that are supposed to scan your website and tell you if it has any accessibility issues or if it's WCAG compliant. And these tools, as the industry, we all know that they only find about 30% of issues on a website. But none of the tool makers, when they're offering these tools to people on their websites, none of the tool makers advertise up front on the screen where people enter these tools and actually use them, press the button. They don't say that they're only going to find 30% of issues. This means that website owners do the scan, fix the issues it finds, and they think they've suddenly achieved accessibility. And that doesn't even begin to tell the truth. So it's just a general comment, really, that we really need to highlight this matter as widely as possible to pressure the test tool makers to be more upfront and more open about the limits of their tools. I don't know how much other people agree with me, but this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine.
I think it's definitely a mixed bag in my experience, Guy. I think there are definitely a lot of companies out there that oversell what their tools do, and also they also don't seem to know what they're doing themselves. So there seems to be a lot of companies that claim to help you be accessible with very horribly inaccessible websites. I think in my experience, like, I've certainly talked to people who work for some of these tool companies who have been transparent with me off the record, like about the level, you know, that they can test to. I don't think I've ever taken the time though to look at what they publicly say on the websites, maybe where you download or purchase them. So I can't comment on that part, but I definitely am going to go and have a look after you've pointed it out, you know, to see if any of them are transparent. It sounds like they're not from what you're saying. But I totally agree with you. Like, in my experience, when I'm talking to people, I will say, look, automation gets you 30 to 40% at the very most. So
yeah. Yes. Sorry.
That's my experience. I don't know if anyone has
sorry, I've got an echo happening here. That threw me a moment. The best website for this is WebAIM. They don't actually mention it on the page where you press the go button, but they do have a help page, and on that help page they are very clear. You know, they set out say it about 6 times. You still need to have human testing for it. But the other cases, you may have to run through the whole test, and then there might be a little sentence at the end. Actually, you also have to have human testing as well. Yeah,
definitely agree. I've definitely seen in the last year, I think as accessibility has become more prominent, possibly because of, you know, new legislation coming in, it feels like there is companies popping up claiming to be very experienced and can help you out, and a lot of them seem to be a bit like smoke and mirrors.
But the thing is also that accessibility is not easy, right? I kind of get the tools that scan for 30% of the issues, but they just have to be, I mean, I think it's because they're limited by their understanding of a freemium versus a premium model, right? You can totally do really good sound-free versions of a software and still run a good business, because you also have a premium that adds genuine value to a smaller, you know, section of customers, but who genuinely need these types of added features, while you still maintain and run a free version of your software that also provides genuine value to most of, you know, to a broader spectrum of people. but you can't sell the scaled down version as the premium. You have to be upfront, and that's to do with the transparency bit, right? Just be transparent with what you sell or give out, and say, we give out this is sufficient for most people, for most sites. If you run larger sites with these types of in this industry with this capacity, or the so and so many users, or whatever the criteria could be, we advise you to look at our premium that also offers this, like reporting, etc., etc. Maybe even tips for developers, etc. So there are lots of ways of doing this, but it's a matter of being transparent about what you offer and don't offer.
Yeah, I think all that is valid, Trine, and I think there are a number of tools out there that offer like free and paid for versions that maybe do a bit more. I think the problem Guy was describing is it's a little bit different though, actually. So even if you had like the most expensive paid tool in the world, most experienced accessibility people will tell you it's only possible to do about 30 or 40% of things in an automated way, because the other 60% needs like human knowledge and intuition that just isn't possible to codify.
Oh, okay.
So I guess there's two issues. Your point is totally valid, but there's also another point where there are companies that are claiming, to do things that other people say is completely not possible. So yeah, I don't know if that changes your thinking. I can see you're nodding at process.
Yeah, but I actually didn't know that, you have to, that so much of accessibility assessment is a manual process. I'm surprised about that, but when you explain that, it makes sense that then they should definitely be transparent about that. Maybe they could even sell consultancy on the side. Why not?
That's what most of the more kind of honest companies in this space do. They will sell their tools, but they will tell you, look, this is how far it's going to get you. If you want to go the rest of the way, you're going to need to hire the humans that we have. So yeah, it's that and in the last couple of years, I feel like I've seen a few companies pop up that are just really trying to sell the software, and they're trying to claim it will do things that it doesn't really do in reality, or it does a bad job of it. But people that are maybe don't understand accessibility very well, they kind of get sucked in by the sales pitch.
Yeah, obviously, because it is kind of a how do I put it? It almost seems a little bit like magic. I know that but it is. It's this mysterious, huge area, a huge important area with, and with the accessibility guidelines. I've read through them. How do you pronounce it, by the way? I always say WCAG, but that's probably not correct, right?
No, I mean, some people say that. I say WCAG, but people say WCAG as well.
Yeah, but I've read through the most recent ones. I read the old ones, and then finally the new set came in 2018, I believe. But it's just, it's a massive document to read through. It's exhaustive, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Even people like myself who've been doing this a long time still find that document challenging. Yeah. And you will still find people who have been doing this stuff for decades deliberating how to interpret some of the guidance in there.
Yeah.
So it's comprehensive, but it is tough to use.
For sure. Not all of it is, equally easy to understand, for sure.
Yeah. So I got a few comments in the chat. Andy, do you think this is an area that needs an experiential and educational campaigns to build trust? It sounds like a lack of knowledge and trust. Lewis, are you talking about trust in the tools we're talking about? Like, please go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to discuss.
So when you say like people believe they can use automated tools, so part of that is how the tooling is communicating itself. I'm not 100% sure that that's a solvable problem because no one's going to come up to you and say, well, I might be really good at this. As far as I know, I'm great. You know, that it's just a hard conversation to have. But so on the other side, where you say like only a certain percentage of this can be codified.
Yeah.
So I'm not an accessibility expert. I'm an engineer. Whenever I hear something can't be codified, I think needs more work. Everything can eventually be codified. So it's making people understand why, you know, what the limitations are. And it feels like perhaps some people use tools because they don't understand. You know, it almost feels like a convenient thing that there has to be hands-on consultancy. Things can't be codified because for their ISO accreditations, they can be codified. There are applications that can 100% guarantee you get a pass at that, and that's a massively complicated thing. So it's communicating to them, well, actually, maybe this thing is an emerging thing. So it's not to knock what you guys are doing. It's more to say, I think that it's a hard conversation to say there's just things that we have to do manually. People have to understand why they have to be manual, and that it might not be a permanent thing, but only through the manual work now can you make the discoveries to be able to invest in the automation tooling to get them 50%, 60%. I mean, people are very familiar with this from other disciplines that they deal with, that you start off in an area, and as it's growing, your understanding, you get more coverage, you might get more discovery.
Do you know what, Lewis, it's a really interesting discussion, Lewis. Like, I think what we'll do is, given the time, I'm conscious we're kind of running over time a bit, but I don't want to shut the discussion down. I will see if I can dig out some articles around this, because you're entirely right, like the state of the art in terms of automation, what can be done automatically is always evolving. And I think most people that work in accessibility, I don't think they're trying to keep it down so that they can keep themselves in a job from a human point of view. I do think people are, you know, being honest about where the technology is right now and where those gaps are. So like, I can't think of a list off the top of my head of the things that are hard to do automatically, but I'll try and dig out some articles for you around that. And you're right, you know, as time goes by, technology is always improving. But I think right now there are definitely companies that are overselling it.
Yes, I can perhaps jump in here, just give one example just to show the reason why this is so. Giving alt text to images, for those who don't know, an image must always have an alternative text to tell blind people what the image is about and what information it's conveying. And, you know, for a complex image, this can be quite a long description, and there's no software tool that can decide fully what's in an image. Image recognition tools are really only in their infancy. And even when you've decided what the image is about, it depends what context it's shown in as to what kind of information it's supposed to be giving the user. So you have to look at the surrounding context of the rest of the web page as well. So that's just one example to show that there's a difficulty there that's probably never going to be codified, at least not in the next couple of centuries.
Yeah, so I'll just put a link on the chat, Lewis. I'll definitely try and keep this chat going on Twitter, because it's a really good discussion. And there are some things where tools are better than people. Like, you know, tools are great for testing a lot of things very quickly across a huge number of pages, and humans are not good at doing that. Humans are good at looking at more complex functionality that has a lot of complex interactions, and that is hard to do for an automated tool in its current state, you know, the current state of technology in 2020. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm conscious it's coming up 9:20, and we were supposed to finish at 9, and Elaine is still diligently typing away for us. So I should probably bring it to a close now. Trine, thank you so much for your time. I know it's actually an hour later for you, right? It's 10:20.
It's okay. curfews and deadlines are weird in Corona times. So, but thank you very much for inviting me, Andrew. It was really a pleasure to speak to you guys and ladies, and I hope that it gave you a little bit of food for thought. Feel free to reach out on Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever you feel most comfortable if you have any questions or you want to connect. Thank you very much for listening.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, it's definitely a great talk. It's obviously got a lot of good discussion going, more than we've got time for tonight, but let's keep it going. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone else for joining. Appreciate it. Thank you for bearing with us with technical issues. But yeah, we will hopefully see you in about a month's time in May for Global Accessibility Wednesday.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. And do you have the link for the event in May, the global event?
We don't have a link for our event yet because we haven't set it up, but I'll put a link in the chat to Global Accessibility Awareness Day just before I go.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's the longest web address ever, but it's the 21st of May. There's lots of accessibility communities around the world that will be doing events for it. Like we would have done one in person. We were planning an in-person one, but we've obviously had to cancel that. So, yeah, we'll see.
Thank you. I didn't heard about.
Okay, yeah, it's been around for about 6 or 7 years. It's like just a community-driven one day a year to recognise digital accessibility.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining. Okay, thanks for joining, everyone, and yeah, we'll see you next time.